Welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of July 11th, 2022. Now, I did a very off-topic podcast last week, and I'm going to do another one this week. And I try not to do two of them that are so far off in a row, but sometimes the timing is all you can deal with. And this week's podcast really couldn't wait a whole lot longer, and last week's was specifically about Independence Day. So what you gonna do? That's where we are, my friends. And so I apologize in advance for the timing. And that said, I hope you enjoy this week's podcast because I'm enjoying making it. This was the finale last week of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Paramount's got an interesting kind of perspective on Star Trek these days after years of not really doing anything with Star Trek, partially because they didn't want to and partially because they had some limitations due to their split off at the time from Viacom. They couldn't do a lot with the Star Trek property, even though it had been historically very successful for them. They just didn't know what to do with it after Enterprise didn't work out in the 2000s. And so they let it sit for a while, let the films kind of take the shine. And remember, at that time, Paramount Pictures was different from CBS Studios, which was the company that was doing the television shows. So now they're all one big happy family again. Now, I did enjoy Strange New Worlds, and I enjoy, for the most part, all of the new Star Trek shows that are out there, to different degrees. I think each one is good and each one has its flaws, and I don't want to go too far into describing the entire Star Trek universe. I just want to go into Strange New Worlds, because it's the one that just ended its 10-episode run just last week. And it's also probably the only one that I can say I wish had gone longer. I think that the other ones were probably just about right for the season length that they had, but Strange New Worlds could definitely have lived with another 5, even 10 episodes in this season. I would have been perfectly fine with it. Like several of the other Star Trek properties, Star Trek Strange New Worlds exists because the fans kind of wanted it. And look, it's great to support your fan base. I think that you should support your fan base. It doesn't do a whole lot to bring in new fans necessarily, but in this case, I think that it's a good way to introduce people to the Star Trek universe. You see, the original Star Trek, needless to say, it ran from 1966 to 1968 and was very influential in the years after that, really because there was not a lot of really thoughtful science fiction at the time. Contrary to what a lot of folks will say, Star Trek was kind of woke even from day one. It was always kind of bringing in social issues and just doing it in a really subtle way, perhaps not as in your face as we say now, but the world has changed. The idea of the original Star Trek was that it was completely episodic, like almost all television of the day. Because there were no DVRs, there were not even VCRs, you couldn't really learn what happened from episode to episode. There were no real season-long arcs. Everything resolved and everybody was fine at the end of the episode. It had to be that way because, you might miss a week and not know what was going on. And it's just nice to pick up the next week and know that everybody was fine and you didn't really need to spend your entire life devoted to a particular show, even though, needless to say, some of us are. I think I keep saying needless to say a lot, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Not important, I suppose. Well, Star Trek The Next Generation, which is the one that the younger generation kind of likes, the millennials kind of get into Star Trek The Next Generation, certainly was episodic to start with, but yes, it got into some arcs. It got into the kind of this long-term struggle stuff and kept bringing back recurring characters. Star Trek Deep Space Nine was the first one with sort of a season-long arc of Star Trek, and Star Trek Voyager, you could argue, was really episodic within the idea of an entire show-long arc. Star Trek Enterprise vacillated between being kind of episodic and having kind of a season-long goal, which they did later, just trying to find its footing. Of all of the shows, it wasn't necessarily the best received, but as I said, this isn't really about all the Star Trek shows. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a background. All the new Star Trek shows, with the exception of Strange New Worlds, however, are really completely arc-driven. There's a central story for the season, and everything's in the service of that central story. And that's very common today, just like episodic shows were very common back in the 1960s. However, Strange New Worlds is a throwback. Strange New Worlds was designed from day one to be a return to the original Star Trek premise of the USS Enterprise going through the universe and seeing what was going on from place to place to place, and and everybody basically ending up okay. There's a little bit of growth, a little bit of an arc. Yes, there is, absolutely, because you couldn't really get away without it, I suppose. But it is much more episodic than everything else. And when the fans saw Captain Pike, who was, the pilot of should say the captain of the original Enterprise back in its very first pilot, that's where I got the word pilot from. He was the captain. The Pike character was reintroduced in Star Trek Discovery, and fans really wanted to see it. Fans wanted to see a new show based around him and the crew of the Enterprise gallivanting around the universe, just the same way that Kirk did back in the 1960s. And Paramount was happy to provide it. It took a couple of years for it to happen, but they came up with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and folks have uniformly loved it. I think it's the best of the Star Treks that are available now. I really like it. And while I have said all of that, now I am going to proceed to pick it apart, because that is what you do with Star Trek shows. If you are at all a Star Trek fan, you know that a lot of the fun of Star Trek is arguing about this or that or the other thing, and whether or not this is properly related to that, and all of that. The first thing I want to say is Star Trek Strange New Worlds does not really contain a whole lot that is strange. It's very comfortable. It does not contain a whole lot that is new, because after all, it's going back to worlds and that we've seen before, and a ship that we've seen before. And speaking of worlds, a lot of the episodes don't take place on worlds. They take place on the ship. So I'm going to argue with the name, even though we all know that it kind of came from the original opening to the original Star Trek show where they used those words. I get it, but I know why they called it that. I'm just being a little bit picky. The idea that Christopher Pike is a completely different captain is great. That he's a little bit more seasoned and heartfelt, and that we know that he has a strong belief in faith, and that he's full of heart, not necessarily faith of the heart. That's a little joke for you fans of Star Trek Enterprise, but that he really kind of is a peaceful guy. He's an explorer. He's a thoughtful guy. He's in many ways the opposite of the very action-based Kirk or the very logical-based Picard. And so it's interesting to see how a captain like that is going to handle different challenges. And indeed, if you've watched the season finale, no spoilers here, but you understand that that's really very much at the center of what's being talked about. You also get to see other familiar characters when they were younger, and you get to see how they got there, and a little bit of that connective tissue that brings everybody closer to the original series, and that's cute, and that's a lot of fan service. The uniforms are okay. Some are good, some are bad. The nice thing about the uniforms is they do look like they could work in a more casual kind of space-based office environment, as opposed to the Discovery uniforms, very constraining and very uncomfortable. And since we've all gotten used to comfortable clothes in the last couple of years, it makes sense that we'd see a Star Trek where people are doing exactly the same thing. But I will give it to this with Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Surprisingly, it's a show that everybody can enjoy. Yes, there is a literally huge amount of fan service. You can pick out just 20 or 30 things in each episode that just are nothing but for the fans and by the fans and about the fans. It's all there for you. And the very last episode, again, no spoilers, really is completely very, very closely tied to something else. And if you are familiar with that prior work, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But if you're not, it still is a really good adventure. And that's what's really kind of amazing. I watched Strange New Worlds with somebody who was not, really a huge Trek fanatic, who wasn't as deeply steeped in the lore of Trek, and they had a good time with it. Why? Because it's a little bit more easily digestible. Looking at the other Star Trek shows that are available now, most of them are they take a lot of emotional commitment. And especially Picard is just nothing but pure fan service. It's like, we're going to show you this and this and this and this thing that you always wanted to see. It doesn't necessarily make it very entertaining for somebody who hasn't devoted their life to it. And you need a balance. You need a mix of shows that are going to be serving those older fans, those people who have literally been at it for 55 years, as well as the newest fans, the folks who really are going to be hopefully taking Trek into its next half century, and so that it's something that continues to evolve, continues to grow, and isn't completely bound by the 1960s. I couldn't help but hear a lot of the chatter that went around from the old timers that said, oh, well, this particular thing or that particular thing, how is it that it looks so much different from the original show and it looks so much more advanced and all that? Well, folks, you're making a show in 2022 as opposed to making it in 1966. Everything's going to look a lot better. They just have the budget for it. And on top of which, that's what we see. That's what we expect. We don't want to see cardboard sets and, computers that fill up entire rooms. That's not what we do anymore. This is a show based really in 2022, about 2022 issues and our potential optimism for the future, something that's very hard to come by, especially lately. And that's kind of another thing that really makes it very endearing, is where, yes, every Star Trek show has within it a component of hope, but Strange New Worlds is really the only one that makes you feel like things could honestly get better. And we all need a lot of that right now. And I think that's one of the reasons that Strange New Worlds succeeded. I will say again, I wish they had done 25 full episodes of this season. It would have ended up being real expensive, and I get that. But on the other hand, it would have kept me from canceling Paramount Plus like I just did, because, I only watch Paramount Plus when there's new Star Trek shows, and they don't have any at the moment. If you haven't checked out Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and you're still made it all the way through this podcast, and which would surprise me if you weren't some sort of Trek fan to begin with, but if you have made it all the way through this podcast, check out Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Even though it is neither strange nor new, nor always has worlds in it, it's still pretty good, and it's got some lighthearted humor, and there's a lot of good stuff to enjoy about it. In the end, you'll end up feeling probably better than you did when you started. That's pretty rare today, and it's something, as I said, we need an awful lot more of. That's about it for me on the Solid Signal podcast. I went kind of long on this one because it's something I like talking about. Remember to like, share, and comment. Always makes me look good, and I will see you next time on the Solid Signal podcast.